The Catchment Area. Written by Holly Walsh. Read by Catherine Tate.
Nothing gets an estate agent excited like an outstanding Ofsted report. It doesn't matter what kind of cesspit you're trying to shift. Once the government declares your local primary in the top 8%, a flotilla of conscientious parents will be begging you to rent them that bedsit above the chip shop. And that is exactly what happened with Catchment Primary in the London suburb of Forest Park. Like every parent, Jeremy and Naomi Blake wanted the best for their daughter Lola. Sure, they earned enough to send her to private school, but the Blakes were Prosecco socialists, less flashy and arguably nicer than champagne socialists. They believed sending their daughter to a state school to be an important political statement, although obviously not enough to send her to the bog-standard one at the end of their road. And despite a fairly unremarkable toddlership, they knew their precious only child was special. Lola deserved the best. And so the day Catchment Primary received its outstanding Ofsted report, the Blakes decided to uproot en famille and move to within 400 yards of the school's outstanding gates. It was only temporary. They had no intention of staying in the area. The local high street had a Greggs, for God's sake. They just had to stick it out for 6 months, and then it was straight back to their spacious terrace with views of the park. However, the catchment area for Catchment was so small, there were simply no houses on the market. Naomi called Flickton's 3 times a day. For their part, the Flickton boys circled the area hourly in their branded minis, like flies around an inflated turd, waiting for someone, anyone, to either move out or drop dead. They secretly prayed for a cold snap to finish off a couple of pensioners, but the spring was disappointingly mild. The market seemed impenetrable. Then one morning, Naomi received a call from Flickton's with good news. They might have found her a place, but she needed to get there fast. After she parked her oversized BMW, blocking in the car behind, Naomi looked up at the house, an immense Victorian end of terrace with grand pointy gables. An estate agent was there waiting for her. He was tall with a wide tie and a loose metal watch strap. "Hi, Glenn from Flickton's." He reached out his hand for a sweaty shake. "Now don't get too excited, it's a bit of a doer-upper, but you can literally see the school from the garden. Basically, though, you're going to have to make a decision fast. I need a yay or nay by lunchtime." "Of course," said Naomi. "Come and meet the owner. She's, a character." Mrs. Myers-Dabb was in the sitting room and was aged somewhere between 70 and dead. She wore a large flowing caftan and badly applied mascara that made her lashes look like fat spiders. She turned to her guests. "Can I get you a tea?" asked Mrs. Myers-Dabb, picking up a teapot. "It's rooibos. I have it sent from India by a lover." Glenn gave Naomi a look as Mrs. Myers-Dabb poured the tea. Naomi stared at the wall of curious paintings and objets d'art. She could see what Glenn meant by a doer-upper. The house certainly had had its day, but it also had a real charm. Just as she was calculating what shade of Pharaoh ball she'd do the hallway, Mrs. Myers-Dabb opened the double doors to the garden. "I suppose you'll want to see your grotto." Mrs. Myers-Dabb pointed out into the garden, which backed right up to the school. Halfway up, next to the water butt, was a large caravan. Glenn from Flickton's grinned like a prick. Open plan interior, integrated kitchenette, light and spacious reception area, and a freestanding bath. He pointed to a rusting iron tub that doubled as a water butt. Naomi stared at the caravan. "How much is it?" "Oh gosh, money," said Mrs. MD, as though it hadn't crossed her mind. "It's 2K per PCM, said Glenn from Flickton's, as though it was all he'd been thinking about. £2,000 a month was extortionate for a mildewy shed on wheels, but with no other options, Naomi gave Mrs. Myers-Dabb her best fake smile. "Where do I sign?" And so the family rented out their home with its integrated wine fridge and functioning roof and moved into the caravan. The first night was cold and depressing. 2 foxes had loud sex under the front wheel arch. Inside her massive house, they could see Mrs. Myers-Dabb sitting by the fire, smoking a shisha, feeding their cash into one of those note-counting machines. The next morning, the Blakes were woken by voices. "As you can see, this bijou apartment is south-facing with a large outdoor space. And look at this, double doors, or French flaps, as they're called." Jeremy stuck his head out of the caravan door. "Morning, Mr. B," said Glenn from Flickton's. He was standing with a family next to a newly erected tent. "Morning," said Jeremy. "I'm Marcus Hughes," said the chap. "I suppose this makes us neighbours." Jeremy tried to muster a smile. The Hughes were also temporarily moving to enrol their son Nico at Catchment Primary. They could just tell he had something about him and he needed to be pushed. From the caravan, Jeremy watched Nico try to kick over the water butt. What a little shit. Outside, Marcus Hughes counted out £2,000 in cash to Mrs. Myers' dab. By the following weekend, at least a dozen families had moved into tents in the garden. At first, the Blakes were pissed off. They hadn't signed up to live on a fucking campsite. But the kids seemed thrilled by their new setup, and actually, it wasn't that bad. In fact, as the days went by, they started to rather enjoy their new commune. After all, they all shared the same high horse, and they were doing all this for the good of their glorious children. Things went from good to better. By the second weekend in the camp, there was almost a festival atmosphere. Everyone felt a smug new sense of liberation. This reminds me of Glastonbury '96, said Naomi. Don't you just feel so free? Oh God, yeah, said another mum. Plus the 4G reception is really good here, and I get free delivery right to my tent flats with Amazon Prime. The community soon fell into a day-to-day routine. As the first ones in, the Blakes took up the mantle of village elders. They arranged a kitty for things like firewood and Ocado deliveries, the modern version of hunter-gathering. There was the small issue of the rubbish pile at the end of the garden, but they'd be out by January, so really, who gave a toss? By the second month, the novelty of al fresco living had worn off. London experienced the hottest August since records began, and the rubbish pile began to reek. People grew increasingly short-tempered with one another, especially when it came to who controlled the Spotify playlist. There's only so much Buena Vista Social Club even the most middle-class commune can stomach. By the third month, the community began to let itself go, literally. One afternoon, Jeremy came back from work early. He'd been asked to leave his job. His personal hygiene wasn't great, and the management were worried he was having a breakdown. In the privacy of the caravan, Jeremy allowed himself a freak out. "I don't know what to do," he cried into the fold-downable sink-cum-coffee table/cupboard. "How am I going to pay for Lola's Mandarin lessons and ukulele class? We can't stay here shelling out all this money to that old hippie. This has gone too far." Naomi slapped him. "I haven't gone this long without my espresso machine to give it up now. I don't care what you do. Find the money." A week later, they swapped their huge car for 3 months' rent. The fourth month was the worst. The bottom of Mrs. Myers' Dab's garden now resembled a shanty town. Those parents without a job, which was most of them by now, spent much of the day scavenging for firewood in local skips. Occasionally, Mrs. MD would invite them in for a go on her indoor lavatory, but with her newfound wealth, she was often away in Nepal visiting another of her lovers. The community scaled back their organic deliveries to just food for the kids. The children always looked beautifully turned out. They had no idea anything was up. They still had their iPads and Uggs and toothpaste and wind-down time. But for the parents, it was a living hell. Meanwhile, the rubbish mountain at the end of the garden was getting bigger. Locked in the caravan, Jeremy was becoming increasingly paranoid. He was experiencing serious withdrawal from olives and Merlot, and it was doing weird things to his brain. It was all getting a bit Kurtz from Apocalypse Now, but, near a Dulwich. He stayed up late into the night, checking and double-checking the school's admission policy, just in case he'd missed something that might mess up their grand plan. The next morning, Jeremy called a meeting. He pinned up a map on the side of the caravan and, using Lola's compass, marked out the boundary of the catchment area. Technically, he said, it started halfway down the garden. Although Glenn had assured them that it was to do with postcodes rather than actual distances, this could jeopardise their child's place in the school. "We've no choice," said Jeremy dramatically. He'd watched far too much Game of Thrones. "We must move towards the crap." And so they dragged the caravan and the tents to the very edge of the rubbish mound. At least the smoke from the fire masked some of the stench. A week before the school deadline, the official school application forms arrived. Everything was straightforward. Parents' names, occupation, proof of address. And at the bottom, in small print, was one sentence. "Please note, due to our policy of prioritising existing pupils' siblings, we have only 11 places available this year." 11 places. But there were 12 kids in the camp. The parents panicked. One of the mums was sick in a bush. Jeremy took a stand. God, he loved the sound of his own voice. "The last family to join must leave." They stared at the parents. "But that's not fair. We've all been here for 6 months. We're all eligible. Besides, Casper's far too emotionally intelligent to go to a normal school. We've got his heart set on Oxford. If you do this, he shouted, I'll drown myself in the water, but... He won't, said his wife, a bit embarrassed. Even though she was desperate, she couldn't bear making a scene. He made a run for the tank, but was tackled by 2 other parents. In the kerfuffle, an awning tipped into the campfire and set alight. The community ran back towards the house for safety. They banged on Mrs. Myers-Dabb's door, but she was with one of her many lovers on a yoga retreat in Goa. By now the fire had reached the rubbish pile, filled with months of Badwa bottles and free-range egg boxes. It whooshed into flames. Within minutes the fire had breached the fence and was lapping at the window of the school's art block. The roof went up first, then the sides. The commune watched as their precious Catchment primary began to burn. There was only one word for the devastation: outstanding. 1 month later, the Blakes were back in their spacious house with its views of the park. Still shell-shocked by their 6 months of hell, they struggled to adjust to regular bathing and a fridge. Everything they'd been through had been a monumental waste of time. Naomi had to take a job at Greg's. Jeremy had lost 1/3 of a toe to trench foot. Meanwhile, Catchment Primary had been declared a no-go zone. It would be out of action for at least a year. In early February, the Blakes received a letter from the council. They decided to merge Catchment with the bog-standard primary at the end of their road. The Blakes couldn't believe it. After everything they'd been through, Catchment Primary was coming to them. Jeremy cried when he read it. The campsite, the fire, the missing bit of toe, it all worked out for the best. They immediately arranged a meeting with the admissions officer. She had a kind face and a cup that said, keep calm and eat tea. The admissions officer explained that technically they'd missed the deadline, but she'd bend the rules for them. What a lovely lady. She just needed them to fill out the admissions book. Name of parents, occupation, proof of address in catchment area for previous 6 months. Sorry? What was that last thing? Asked Jeremy. Proof of address in our catchment area for the previous 6 months. You have lived in your house for the last 6 months, haven't you?